Okay, hi everyone. Welcome to the last session of CHIWORK for this academic year. I'm Navina, a postdoc at Harvard and one of the hosts for CHIWORK along with Toby, Max, and Shadan. Thank you to, and Aaron. And thank you to Andrew, Orit, and the student volunteers, Alberta, Isabel, and Nabil for making the series possible. And as usual, we'll have a recorded Q&A for the first half and then unrecorded discussion for the second half. Feel free to put your questions in the chat at any time and we'll get to them. I'm excited now to introduce our guest, Vera Khovanskaya. Vera is a Computing Innovations Postdoctoral Fellow at the University of California, San Diego, where she's a member of the Just Transitions Initiative and the Design Lab. Her research examines the impact of data collection in the workplace, the opportunities and challenges of data-driven approaches to worker advocacy, and the barriers to worker-centered and community-driven technology design. Her work has earned awards in CSCW and CHI and DIS, and she's completed her PhD in information science at Cornell, where she was a member of the Culturally Embedded Computing Group and a member of the Intel Science and Technology Center for Social Computing. She's worked in design and research at Google, Yahoo, and Intel as well. Thank you, Vera, for being with us today.
Thank you for introducing me.
So to get started with the Q&A, I'm kind of curious about how this line of work started. So can you tell us about your work on the use of data in US labor history and what motivated that work?
That's right. So the research, there are like two, I would say, like parts to the research. There's like the impact of data collection and how like data collection transforms work in the workplace. And there's like what happens when groups of workers get together and try to leverage same or similar data collection, data-driven approaches to advocate for themselves. So it's like the data is already changing the workplace and workers are coming together and trying to do something about it in data innovative ways. And I would say that like my research towards both of those things was kind of happening at the same time with events that were already happening in my life, but also kind of like serendipitous. So there's a cute story here that I'm happy to share. Well, cute is like, okay, it was like cute and also horrifying. I was in the middle of my candidacy exams when I was kind of found myself in the middle of an active unionization election at Cornell. So I was studying, at the time I thought my research would be about academic measurement and evaluation. So I was looking at altmetrics and the sort of history of like workplace measurement in a workplace that I was already a part of, which was academic work. And I was doing my lit reviews for my exams, so sort of tracing like the long arc of scientific measurement in the workplace and like, Taylorism, blah, blah, blah. So sort of studying that academically with an eye for thinking about how it was going to shape the work of academic workers like us. And also I was on the organizing committee for the Cornell Graduate Student Union. So I think I was kind of living both like acutely observing the ways in which our workplace was a workplace where, workers and administrators had very different stakes, I would say, in our unionization campaign. And in, obviously I had a kind of keen eye into the way that we were reporting on our work and folks were being evaluated because that's what I was studying. And I was in this union drive and we really were using like databases and Google Sheets and all of this to try to coordinate our campaign. And I was like, wow, like what if it is true that in our efforts to get the best of what you get when you systematically collect structured data, like what if our efforts to get the best of these data tools are also unwittingly reproducing the worst effects of data collection, which have to do with like centralization of knowledge and decision making within our organization as a union. It's like, were these tools, they were helping us for sure, but they were also posing like real roadblocks in our organizing over things that seemed really benign and fixable, like, changing access permissions in a column, or like, why can't we get this or that? So I think like the candle was burning on both ends for me. And I was like, I have to study this more deeply. And a lot of times, like, I'm interested in where we got the things that seem normal and practical and reasonable. And that involves kind of tracing the longer arc of how they got there. So yeah, that's where I was at the time. And the serendipitous, very like the cuter part of the story, like there's nothing cute about being on an organizing committee in the middle of a union election. That's very hard and very stressful. But I was in the library picking up some books for my A exam, and I found, like, kind of just on the shelf, like not beknownst to me, it wasn't what I came here for. There was a book that was titled A Trade Union Evaluation of the Time Study. The time study is Frederick Winslow Taylor's time and motion study, you know, this sort of like proverbial, like the stopwatch and the Taylorist. And there was this book that was like, trade unions are looking at this and they're evaluating like the scientific merits of the time study. And I was like, wow, that's crazy. Like, I didn't know that trade unions were publishing research kind of debunking the objectivity of the time study in the 40s and the 50s. It's like, it blew my world. And I started studying that. And because the circulating collections of libraries often kind of mirror the non-circulating or archival collections of the library, I was like, it just so happened that Cornell had the archival records of the management engineers who had published the book and who had also worked as industrial engineers employed by the Garment Workers Union in order to use their professionalized knowledge in order to advocate for workers and to kind of intervene in the industrial engineering scientific management space by publishing these critiques of those methods. So that's how I found that part of my research.
And can you talk about some of the, I guess, things that you discovered, like in terms of their tactics and how it might still be relevant to organizing today?
That's right. There's definitely I would say broadly, there's a series of practical benefits to having folks in your union who can work with worker data. Like they can, collect the data and kind of make empirical arguments that leverage the same sort of empirical or like rationalizing logic that your employer would use. So like if your employer has collected data about how long it ought to take for folks to do something and then uses that to reinform like your work process or how you get paid or stuff like this, having someone in your union come in and like collect some of this data to sort of push back can be very useful because you can sort of use the logic of management against management, right? But at the same time, like nobody likes being observed in detail as they try to do their work, because you have a kind of intuitive understanding that someone is trying to take knowledge about your work and like use it in different ways, and people don't like being watched. So I think the union kind of would use these engineers, use them very selectively. So I think there's like, I talk about strategies, like there's a strategy of like collecting data, there's a strategy of using data to contest management practices, but there's also a strategy that I think is really important, which is a strategy of being very selective about when you use these methods, to kind of like selective participation, selective engagement. And some of the things that the historical case sort of sensitized me to was that the union was very reluctant to collect data if they didn't see a clear path for it leading to an improvement in work conditions or an organizing win. Collecting data has always been sort of tedious, expensive, breeds suspicion, and it's hard to do in a democratic way, especially since a lot of the tools that we use require very specialized knowledge. And this was true in the 50s and it's true now. So not going in situations where there's not a clear strategy, not going in situations where the union isn't very well established. Like if you already have a kind of rocky organizing situation, like doing a lot of data collection might undermine organizing relationships sometimes. So just like being very careful. And like that's something that we always have to hold, I think, because there's always a promise of like building collecting some cool data, making some cool graphs. Like I think there's a strong impulse to do that. And I think that the union teaches us that there should be a strong countervailing impulse to be like, all right, like this is going to come at a cost. What's the cost and what do we stand to gain? So yeah. Yes.
And Yeah, it was wonderful to hear how a lot of this was actually just stemming from your own experience, like the motivation for doing this work. And did you feel like after doing the research, did you feel like it then kind of informed what you did on a practical level?
Yes. Um, yes. So the unionization campaign that I was on at Cornell was not successful. It was very close. We had we had unfair labor practices, like we had to take Cornell to the labor board, and they were found guilty of whatever they were found guilty of. But the point is that we didn't win. And when you're kind of like in the process of rebuilding your union after like a big loss like this, there's a lot of there are a lot of people who are trying to understand like what happened, or like people who are trying to draw lessons from it, people who are just trying to like document and remember like what's going on, so that we can sort of pass that knowledge to folks in other campaigns, or future campaigns at like this workplace, right? So one of the really big things that I wanted to understand was like, okay, like what what was going on with our data collection? Like we clearly thought that we had the numbers to win, right? But we didn't in practice, which meant that some of our numbers were stale, or just not accurate, or not collected systematically. And this is something I think that maybe a little bit of context is necessary here too. So if you've never organized a union, something that's really, really tough and like actually really empirically interesting about this kind of organizing is that it's very, it is very data driven, and it has always been very data driven, because our American labor law requires a majority vote yes for the union. So you need to get over 50% of the people who are eligible to vote for the union to vote yes. So you're not, you need to know how they're going to vote. And the thing about, stuff in the workplace that has real consequences for people is that if you ask someone like, do you support the union? They say yes or no, like that's not very rigorous. They could be lying to you. So, and you don't want to hang your union election on that. So you have to test people's support for the union. So I think that sometimes if you've never seen this happen from the inside, you think that the union is like folks who go around with like stickers or buttons or shirts or, like signs. And it's like, I think that sometimes people are surprised to discover that each of those events is actually a test leading up to like an election or a strike vote. And like what we're trying to assess is everyone's level of support for the union. So for every action that we see out in the world, there's a database that is tracking like those outcomes in a structured way. And there's like a chain of reporting that data. And in an ideal, like in a healthy campaign, all of that data collection is being, mediated and debriefed, and we're setting up norms to like quantify what different levels of support are, and who is going to collect the data, and who is going to report it to who, and like all of this. So there's like a very like empirical data driven tradition in the labor movement, and that happened before computers, before databases, before anything. It's just before that was on pen and paper, and now it's in the tools. So it's like I was trying to understand how the digital data tools were actually creating like new opportunities and challenges for this kind of organizing. And I was trying to unpack like, well, what happened to us, and like how could it be done? How could it be done differently or better? Or what would I tell someone in an analogous situation, learning what I learned from my own experience. And I also like interviewed a bunch of union staffers, including some of the former staffers from our campaign, but also many other different union staffers in different sectors, all about like what it means to be this kind of union worker who is also collecting data, who is also being evaluated as a paid organizer through their traces in the data tools that we use to collect union data.
You just mentioned how a lot of some of the work that or data collection that you did was in higher ed, and then but you also looked at different sectors, and I know some of I think your CSCW 2019 paper talks about relevance to platform mediated work. I'm curious what differences you've seen across, say higher ed versus platform mediated work versus in what other sectors you've looked at, and how you feel like the findings have been different or maybe similar.
It's like there's the one common thread I would say across all different kinds of organizing is like getting a good list together of folks who are in that work, who are interested and could be activated to organize. Like even if it's like a path towards like a legally recognized union versus like, kind of more diffused advocacy versus all this, like finding your people who would be like leaders or instigators of organizing action, like collecting information about them, activating them, not having them not burn out, and like tracking them, like that's always going to be true all the time. But there are some things that are very specific, not only just to like unionizing in a particular sector, but even within one sector, within one unionization arc, like your data strategy is going to be different, like kind of leading up to the election, like right before the election, and then like right after the election, everything also changes. And once a contract is put into place, like it's a different data strategy. So like it is a very dynamic situation. The goals are very different, and the tools that are used and the way that people orient to the tools is going to be very sensitive to like not only the broader like sector goals context, but also like locally within the narrative of that organizing effort. So that is something, like, I think because I came into this work very sharpened by like the election or recognition election, I was very like coming at it with this like high stakes, like it's very important to know exactly what your levels of support are exactly right now, because it's going to matter like in a week, or like it's going to matter tomorrow, this sort of stuff. But then it was like very cool to discover that is like just one like very high stakes, but just like one kind of data moment within the long arc of the union's data strategy. And when things are kind of in the downtime, it was interesting to observe like what sorts of decisions were being made kind of more less desperately, and a kind of more respect for the autonomy of union locals, like once they're established and they're kind of already doing their thing, like the folks on the data teams in these national offices are often like actually very reluctant to go in and like survey that data, because it's like, no, like this is your space, this is your union, this is your database. We're not gonna go in there without you asking. And that was a kind of like, that's a kind of like respectful sensibility that sometimes gets, stepped on during moments where it's like, oh, like we gotta win this election right now, but it was really cool to kind of think more broadly beyond like my own like personal entry point into this data space. And I found that when I started doing my research with the folks on the data teams in different unions. But also, yeah, like data collection in the labor movement is like wild. The sort of like the level of like, if we have a recognized union and we have like information about our members, we're sending that data to like the state, they're sending it to the national. If our union's affiliated with AFL-CIO, they're going to send it to AFL-CIO. Like we're maybe going to do some data sharing with like political parties, like if we're going to do kind of coordinated electoral outreach. So we're getting data from the DNC, and like it's going to have a different shape than the way that we store our data. And like you also store your data differently for like members for the purposes of dues collection versus like members for the purposes of organizing them, because folks kind of come in and out of being dues paying union members, especially if it's like precarious or short-term contract work where people are always coming in and out of work. So it's like, the lives of organizers and union members and activists like have all of these data traces that are in fact like very complicated. And like also unions do a lot of work organizing folks that they can't, there's a lot of unions kind of supporting the organizing of gig workers, even though gig workers are not currently legally allowed to form legally recognized unions. Like the larger unions still see a potential like benefit for kind of extending support into those campaigns too. So that was like very surprising and very interesting to observe, like what the sort of what the resource sharing and like campaign strategy is for organizing campaigns that don't have a path towards a legally recognized union.
I'm curious if so I mean, you're talking about some of like the very extensive data collection and data sharing that happens about workers. And I'm curious if you saw the effects of that kind of data collection on trust or relationship to the union, or if people were even aware of how extensive the data collection was. Because I mean, I think, in my experience, it's like, like in my mind, this is like important and necessary data collection. But, if you're not familiar with unions, or, if you're just not kind of super sure of your relationship or what your thoughts or support for a union, it might seem more of a fraught relationship. So I'm curious if you saw that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that this, like, everyone is thinking about this too. And I think like there are different attitudes that organizers will kind of take to this conversation. There's no like consensus for like our best practices for mediating like between the benefits and the harms of like organizing data collection, right? There's some folks who are like, I believe in the labor movement. I believe that it'll like outlive me. So therefore it's my job to, take as good of notes as possible so that when I have to leave or like something happens to me, like I can just pass my records on to the next person and they're going to take us forward to the next step. So it's like, yes, it's bad, but it's for a cause that's like, like not bad, but like it has risks, but it's for a cause that's bigger than all of us. And therefore it's like my job to do the best that I can and taking the best records that I can so that it can move beyond me. There are other people who are like, no, actually, like I'm invested in the long-term cause of this union and I don't want to undermine the authenticity of future organizing relationships by giving people information that they shouldn't know, because that's creepy and unsettling, and like maybe it'll stop an organizer from really connecting with a person that they're organizing with. So there's like, there's an attitude of like, save everything, figure it out later. And there's an attitude of like, no, in order to save everything, we actually have to be very judicious about what we record. And kind of folks are like, if you're in the space, you know that there are these different like extremes, and you're like figuring out what is going to make the most sense in your campaign, like in that moment. And I think that like one of the most wonderful things that happens is like if that becomes part of your workplace organizing strategies, like us all coming together and sitting down and deciding like, yeah, what kind of information are we recording? What kinds of records are we keeping separate? Like, oh, we're getting data from, we're getting data from DNC, we're getting data from the union. That's going to live in a different database. And like, obviously we're not going to merge them, because that would be, it carries like different implications that we don't always want to have. So like people are being very thoughtful at all the steps. And like when it's really cool is like when people come together and like make decisions like in a meeting collaboratively about all this stuff, and then kind of like normalize their practices in like this way. There's a lot of work that people do that's just like workarounds, like your data is coming in one shape, but you think it's really important. You and your team have decided it's really important to collect some other stuff that has a different shape. Like you found some way to kind of hack the tool that you have, or you have some script that you write. Like there's just like people learn to do a lot with a little in this data space. And it's like, it's impressive. And it's also like, wow, this is a resource constrained environment a lot of the time. Yeah. But so your question was about the harms, and I guess my answer is that folks are thinking about the harms and like coming up with ways to mediate it, but there is never one. If only there was ever like one consistent strategy for it, right?
Yeah, it sounds like it's extremely contextual and like you said, very selective in terms of when is it really important, and when can we forego it, and also just different strategies towards similar goals.
That's right.
I'm curious if so I think it seems like much of your work has been in the US context, where the climate around labor organizing it's changing, and it's the movement is growing, but it's still, I think, facing a lot of skepticism. And whereas in other national contexts, union activity is relatively higher or strongly organized. And I'm curious if you think that the use of data or technologies or other technologies in organizing has different potential in different contexts as a result.
Yeah. I remember the first time that I gave a talk about my data union organizing work to a predominantly non-US audience. I was at the European Trade Union Institute in Belgium, and I like gave this whole talk about like measuring support for the and I think like the audience was just really confused. They were like, why do you need to calculate how supportive they are for the union? Can you just call up your union and say like you want to join? And I was like, all right, like we got to step back. Like this is a very like this is a data-driven response to like the specific like hostilities and requirements of American labor law, right? On the other hand, the audience was very interested. It's like, oh, like what if we did kind of like apply some of this assessment and like kind of testing stuff for their data needs were different, right? So I think it was interesting to present the work in that space because it kind of like it alerted me to the national like specificness of some of my work, but I think there was also an idea of like, oh, like there are some sensibilities from this like data-driven approach that could be really useful to doing sort of like concerted organized actions, even if our union is not like its recognition is not like mandated, does not mandate the same kind of testing, right? So like if you had an organizing tree and like you were going to check in with different people like that, you want regardless of what stage of your union you are in. And we have tools that folks are building in the United States that kind of like help you use like, all of the advantages of a database to like kind of organize different forms of like human like organizing structures and kind of like tracking who's going to check in with who and who is going to like enter in that data and who's going to check to see if that data is like, debrief about that data. And like we have to do it because it's very, very sharp for us, but actually like that builds a robust and communicative and like effective organizing campaign everywhere.
And speaking of, I guess, stakeholders or actors involved in like the kind of ecology of tools that unions use, your interactions article was fascinating, kind of looking at, I think it's called UNIT, and like the role of venture capitalists in funding organizing tools, and almost disrupting, it sounds like, the role of like internationals, or at least I don't know, that's how they see themselves. I'm curious what you make of that. Is that something that we need to be wary of? And then alternatively, like, are there more worker controlled technologies or tools that are available, and what are the feasibility of those?
Yeah. So I think right. So when I did my field organizers work, like how are like these sort of like on the ground staff, like how are their lives and organizing strategy impacted by the use of the tools? Like that gave me a very selective, like a deep like understanding of like what their experience of the tools was. And I had some ideas about how it could be like made better, like, oh, like what if we distributed tech expertise like throughout these organizations, so it wasn't all sitting like in the national offices. And I was like, well, like, Vera, that sounds great, but like we kind of need to look at these organizations like more broadly to see like what a feasible like recommendation could be, which is what brought me to like the research with the folks, in the data teams and in the software providers, and like the kind of more sort of professionalized technology development angle on bringing these tools into being. And like unsurprisingly, perhaps what I found is that like designing, building, maintaining a data tool is expensive. It's expensive in terms of like financial investment, and it's expensive in terms of like, hiring and retaining access to people with the expertise to kind of work with these systems. So, one way that unions do this is by contracting with a technology provider. This is great because they are going to have like their data experts, and they have a kind of organizational method for, working with them or evaluating them, like, kind of being like an effective software engineering company. It's like we can just contract in that expertise and use it when we need it, and kind of come up with a plan, like a payment plan that works for everyone, right? Sometimes those relationships don't meet the union's needs, and they're like, all right, maybe we're going to insource the development of a data tool. This is also fraught because the union now has to hire and retain, it's like paying competitive salaries to retain tech workers who are going to like build this tool maybe from the ground and like calibrate it to meet the needs of different locals, and also continue to sustain it, right? So I think, and like I've seen unions like do one thing and then do the other thing, or like the other way around. Like there's no clear best strategy here. So you see like a variety of insourcing, outsourcing, and then insourcing what had been outsourced, or outsourcing what had been insourced, like this kind of like idea, where are we gonna get our expertise from, and who is going to be responsible for like the long-term like maintenance of the tool and the expertise needed to manage it. That's just hard. There's like, right, I already said, like I've not observed one most effective strategy for this, but one of the things that I did observe was that like over the long arc of like unions developing their data strategy, like there have been companies coming in and out of being used, and a lot of the reasons why unions kind of like have to do the incredible like downstream like work of migrating off of a tool and migrating onto a different tool is because the companies building those tools get bought, and then like the goal of that company is now changed, or the business plans have changed. Like this is a big thing with a database tool called Salsa Labs. Salsa Labs was acquired, and suddenly everything was different, and suddenly folks had to use something else instead of Salsa Labs. So when the article came out about unit organizing, people were like, oh my God, like they're VC backed. I was like, okay, but like this isn't the first VC backed software that has had like downstream effects in social movements and unions and organizing. Like Van is a software that like anyone who's ever been canvassed for like an electoral vote, like the person probably came to their door using something called Van. Like Van has changed hands many times since it was initially built. It's been bought, it's privately owned. I think it's owned by someone in like Britain now. And like every time these acquisitions happen, like there are downstream effects that are, these organizations have to deal with. And right, so pricing plans also, like if you are just if you're just a small actor for this startup and they need to promise to scale and get really big, and your union's only as big as it is, or only promises to scale as much as it does, they're going to prioritize your needs accordingly, which is to say, sometimes not very much. So unions are also trying to navigate that by like, using their own federated structure to kind of become a larger user base, to be taken, more seriously by these companies. And then they can kind of make a union specific instance of that software and share it with the affiliated unions. That was something really cool that I saw. There's also an effort to, if you have union staffers, there's an idea that maybe folks who have been organizers before came up through the work of organizing. Maybe we should have those folks like be the ones making decisions about the data tool, because they have this like real like on the ground experience that's going to inform like what they think is a good idea or bad idea. Well, I think my internet might have blocked out. Oh, geez. Sorry about that. Okay, no, just me. So there's an effort to send folks to get like data science masters who are already like union employees. This is like a big investment by the union. Then they have to like, hope that person stays on long term, right? But it comes from this idea that like, actually, we don't need to, we can insource our own tech expertise in different ways. But the thing that is like, yeah, uniquely, we can talk about like the real impact of unit is like how big they are and how much they're going to change the landscapes. Like, we don't know. It seems like they're actually kind of like, they're not a very like big company. It seems like the campaigns that they're doing, there are not so many of them. But the unique challenge of UNIT wasn't that it was VC funded, it was that it was like its business model was predicated on like not working with unions, but kind of getting teams who are organizing their workplace to sort of maybe pay them directly through things kind of like dues. And then that would pay for them to be able to exit to community in terms of their software, and also pay for them to be able to retain experts in like legal and organizing and all of this. So if you have folks who are against organized labor kind of financing your startup, and your startup's business model is kind of counterposed to the organized labor structure that we have in the United States, like, yeah, that's something that we have to talk about. That's different than the impact just of VC funding on the tool. So that was kind of what I was trying to tease apart in that article. And I think that like what really hit me when I was doing that work is like, oh, I actually don't know very much about what it means to have a VC funded company, or like what it means to sell voting shares, or like how many, like, because sometimes like some shares have like voting privileges that are like more than the common shares of voting privileges. It's like if I sell off a lot of, like I have investors taking on a lot of those shares, they are going to shape my like decision making at the board level, and like maybe that's going to shape like whether I can or cannot exit to community as I am promising to. And I think that all of this kind of material, like nitty gritty, like VC software stuff is like, we can't help unions assess whether this is like a long-term good or a long-term risky like company to do your data work with, if we can't like evaluate what their own commitments are as like, as a corollary to the way that they've done their board or their voting shares. Like, so it turns out actually that I'm going to have to learn about this a lot more if my goal is to advise or recommend, or like in any way help folks make decisions about their data strategy in our current like software funding economy, where a lot of folks do believe that the only way that you can kind of finance the startup cost to building a new data tool is by getting this VC funding. I think that could be something that changes. And I believe that some of the recent disruptions in the Silicon Valley and venture capital space might push people to consider different options. But like, I think that the fact remains that software development is a resource intensive enterprise with high startup costs. So like, who is financing them and how is like something that we can never stop thinking about if we're thinking about the sort of the data decisions that folks have to make in a variety of different movement building contexts. This is going to be any sort of member organization where the goal is activating and turning out and organizing folks.
It's really fascinating to hear all of this. I mean, I think just so much of union organizing, and I mean, activism in general, is about being able to be independent from the thing that you're, bargaining with, or, working against or critiquing. And it's definitely true for, financially, but also technologically. And yeah, it's really cool to see your work unpacking that.
Yeah.
So I think we can take just maybe a question from the audience. Michael, I don't know if you want to expand on your comments in the chat.
Sure, unless somebody else wants to go first. I often type something into the chat in these meetings and then I get to talk first, and that's not fair. So I'm thinking, safe, Maya, Kimberly, you probably have more questions than I do, and better questions. I should have said Maya, not Maya, sorry. Well, okay, I'll ask my question then. First of all, Vera, thank you for all that you do. This is amazingly great that you're doing this work, and I'm inspiring. I was thinking that there are lots of things in organizations which are dangerous to know or dangerous to be. And Angelica Strohmeyer and I wrote about the notion of selective legibility, that we need ways of communicating amongst an at-risk group, which nonetheless leaves them invisible to the people who would harm them. Angelica's work with sex workers trying to organize, Rosie Bellini's work with survivors of domestic violence, work that we did in Belcour a long time ago about trying to organize not a union, but just representation for what we then very tidily called the sexual minorities, meaning we got up to LGBT. We weren't sure what T was. We sure didn't get any, we didn't know how to say queer. And it was really dangerous work because people were going to lose their jobs if we outed them without intending to. And there's amusing stories. We said, well, we're a mixed group. We're a group of mixed sexual identities. We're not going to tell you who's who. We're just going to advocate. And eventually the vice president we were arguing with said, oh, well, I'm a person of goodwill like them. I guess I don't have to be gay in order to support them. And he did. And so we gave him cover, which was just astonishing. But I'm thinking selective legibility, it seems like that's running through very much of what you're saying. And I guess I'm thinking it generalizes, and I'm not quite sure what this question is, but I think, how do you do that? Especially if someone's going to buy the company that has the data and then disclose it to, right. Yeah, I mean, the data are dangerous to begin with. If the place that's holding them is bought, it might not be only that they'll withhold it, but that they'll actually release it. So how do you manage selective legibility?
Yeah, I mean, I think that definitely, like, you know, I think most people understand that, like, most startups fail, right? So there's this idea of like, okay, if your startup is failing, this is something I was really worried about. It's like, okay, well, if the startup fails, then now they are liquidating their assets. If their assets happen to be lists of folks who are interested in organizing their workplace, like, that's devastating news. We don't want them to sell off those assets. So I think, like, you know, part of what you do if you are smart in this space is you, like, negotiate some sort of data protection clause when you go into working with this company. And that involves, like, anticipating that this could be a downstream effect that you need to protect against. But in the general case of, you know, like, union organizing data collection, like, part of the information that we, like, since the dawn of time, unionists have been interested in is like, well, what would motivate a person to be active in organizing their workplace? And that is their workplace issues. And so that means, like, by the very nature of our organizing work, like, we're kind of interested in understanding what, you know, like, what's people's deepest, darkest, and, like, most motivating, most upsetting, like, workplace experiences that would kind of that they're drawing from to, like, motivate their action in the world. So yeah, like, that data is sensitive. And when it's living in, like, an organizer's notebook or in, like, a binder in the union office, like, it's kind of more intuitively clear who is going to have access to that data, right? But when it's living in the phone and you're activating people to become organizers in the union, they're like, oh, I kind of want to see your list. Like, I want to go talk to some people on there. And then you're like, oh, like, I got to make sure that that is not being secretive in a way that would, like, discourage folks from being active in the union or feeling like we're keeping things from them. But I also have to be respectful of, like, oh, you know, who, like, what is the threshold that a person has to clear in order to have access to some of this stuff that is, you know, risky. I mean, some of it's, like, you know, phone numbers and addresses, like you can't just let you could imagine myriad kinds of abuses that would happen if just anybody had access to this information. So, like, usually what you do is you come up with, you know, I need you to come to this many meetings and, like, complete this many tasks before I take you seriously as a person who's, like, involved in this campaign, and then you can see the data. Or, like, you know, some people, I think, dream that maybe this could be solved through, like, infinitely configurable, like, visibility settings in the database. And it's like, no, but having ready access to configure those access permissions would help a lot, instead of, you know, having to go through, like, an enormous chain of command to, you know, make a column more or less visible, right? So it's, like, neither a technological solution nor exclusively, like, a person solution, but people are working at it from both ends. And the good news, I mean, this is bad, but also good, is that, like, this has been kind of intrinsically part of the data question forever, because we've always been handling very sensitive data.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. I think we can end the recorded portion at this point. thank you, Vera, for such a wonderful conversation and closing out the series. And thank you to the audience and the CHIWORK community more broadly for joining us this year for all these conversations. Yeah, thank you.